Joining me now to weigh in from New York City is America's accountant, Dan Geltrude. Dan, down $7.6 trillion the market is, and that constitutes record, historic, unprecedented growth. Dan Geltrude, your thoughts on these comments from the White House press secretary?
Well, let's start with this. There are a number of politicians out there that like to create class warfare between Wall Street and Main Street. But what do you know? The two are intersecting here. Why? Because when you see Wall Street taking the hit that it's taking right now and has been taking, who suffers? Main Street. We're seeing an enormous evaporation of wealth. Look at what's going on with people's 401ks. So, of course, people are going to be very, very concerned about what's happening. So now, why is this happening? It's happening because we have allowed inflation to get out of control. Now, to try to get it back under control, we're raising interest rates, which, by the way, we're late to the party with. So now what's happening is we have a double whammy going on here. We have a weak economy with rising interest rates. What does that spell? That spells pain for everyone across the board in the United States and beyond. So that's where we are right now.
Yeah, that's where we are. And the Dow dropped 305 points or 1%. The S&P 500 declined 1%. The NASDAQ composite slipped 0.4%. That's a report from CNBC on today, Monday. Now, Dan, as a result, we're not just getting inflation, we're getting stagflation, and we're getting companies who are now, they're putting smaller quantities in the cereal companies. They're making their boxes just a little bit smaller, just a little less serving. Maybe you're going to have a few less chips in your bag of Doritos, but it's going to stay at the same price. These companies are doing everything they can, but all of the downside they're just going to have to dump on the consumer. But they can't do that to a certain point because they're not going to retain their customers. So these companies are scrambling to try to keep prices down so that people don't stop buying from them. What else can they do?
Well, what they're really doing is fooling the consumer. They're saying, well, listen, we're holding prices steady here. But what's happening is you're getting less quantities. So it comes out to one and the same in terms of the price per unit, meaning the individual things you're buying are still getting more expensive. You're just getting less of it and not realizing it. So what's really happening here, Addison, is people are simply getting to the point where they just can't afford things. And when that happens, you have to start prioritizing what is important for me to pay for. Well, I got to pay my rent, I need food, and presumably I got to keep the heat on. And if you can afford to do those things, well, then everything else becomes, well, that's not so important. And what does that do? It slows down the economy. And when you have a slowing economy, which we're having now, you do start to move into stagflation. And by the way, the key factor in stagflation in terms of high inflation, a shrinking economy, we have those two. And the third piece of it is you start to see unemployment rising. And we're seeing a little bit of that right now, although I think it's deceiving, the numbers we get. I think it's worse than what we see. But you do see major employers around the country announcing hiring freezes and that they're starting to reduce the workforce. And that is the final component in stagflation.
Dan, let me ask you real quick, why do you suspect the numbers are worse than what are being reported?
Well, because by nature, what happens is with the unemployment numbers, if you have someone who stops looking for a job, they're not included in the number anymore.
Yeah.
You're only looking at people who are actively searching. So if people say, I give up, I'm not working, they're not part of that number. So that's why I say the unemployment number is really higher than what's being reported.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and you know, coming off the heels of what you were saying about people having to carve out their money for the bare necessities. They don't have, really any extra cash on hand to be thrown around. We have this report from Newsweek. Almost 2/3 of employees have reportedly reduced their short-term and long-term savings contributions since the start of the year, with a third having reduced their 401k contributions, all blaming financial instability in the U.S. So workers are essentially reconsidering putting money into their retirement fund and into their savings because they can't, Dan. And that makes it's really frustrating to hear Biden talk about, the midterm elections, Social Security is on the ballot, your retirement is on the ballot. He is hollowing out people's retirement. They can't afford to contribute to their retirement under this president. They're going to be working till they're in the grave.
Well, you can't blame people for taking this approach, Addison. They're saying, listen, there are things I need today. Yeah. So I'm going to have to forego looking down the road 20 or 30 years with my retirement and make sure I can survive right now. But when you're making that type of decision, we're kicking the can down the road. So yes, what's going to happen is people will have less money in their retirement plans. They start to become reliant upon the government, which puts more pressure on Social Security, and the circle goes on and on here, Addison. It's a bad sign.
Bad sign indeed. Dan Geltrude, thank you for breaking all of this down. Always great to have you on the show.
Thanks, Addison.